Hi, I'm Dr. Emily Friedman. I'm continuing to gather my parties, but this video is a little bit of a confession. I don't want to GM, but I also want to play GM'd games, and I want to figure out the sweet spot for how to do just that. So, what the heck do I mean? Well, this video is inspired a little bit by Kieran Gillen, who, along with Thomas Manuel, has very kindly recommended this little vlog series as of potential interest to folks in the wider TTRPG sphere. And the way that Kieran has described it to his readers is that I'm exploring GM-less games. And indeed, so far, if you look back through the previous videos in this series and probably the videos for some time to come, you're going to see a lot of games that we can qualify as GM-less, where no one is in charge of the fun. You might have a facilitator, uh, a concierge, or something along those lines, but the idea of a power differential where one person is doing an enormous amount of prep work ahead of time and everyone else comes ready to react to that and to prompt the GM to frantically work, that kind of notion that the GM is the world in some sort of simulationist way, is not me, guys. I don't even know that I was that kind of control freak running in Nomine as my first game in the 1990s as the world's absolute worst GM. Like full on godlike GM NPC named Pax. Oh God. I apologize to the past poor human beings who had to deal with my sorry excuse for early GMing. And I've been around some of the most talented GMs in the world. Part of my job in studying the history of actual play is to get to talk to people about their strategies for running the game. I, too, have been fascinated by Matt Colville talking about how he runs games and watching the development of Draw Steel shaped to fit. There's something really appealing and fascinating about the idea of GMing. At the same time, it's incredibly dangerous. We talk so much on YouTube and in Reddit and in all other kinds of places about the labor that GMs take on. And some will put themselves on a cross. It might not actually be shaped like a cross. Maybe it's shaped like a D20 or one of those pointy caltrop D4s. Regardless, there is this kind of noble sacrifice to taking on the responsibility of GMing. You'll also see folks say, but I like GMing because I get to be in charge. I get to play more characters than I would if I was just a player. I get to control the narrative. It's fun. And it's a gift that I give to my players to surprise them, to think about them and their characters and the narrative and provide this kind of bespoke experience. And those are incredibly moving sorts of ways of thinking about GMing as a kind of act of pleasure, an act of creativity, and an act of service. But I can't help but notice that most of the people who talk in those kinds of ways to me are my friends who are dudes. And I'm not. And so my position in the world is one that thinks a lot about the ways in which those kinds of caregiving labors, those acts of service, get coded very differently when men do it in a kind of masculinized way than when women do it in kind of ways that are expected. I think about this when I think about professional GMing, by the way. I've talked to any number of people who've done things like D&D in a castle, and most men that I talk to have a pretty good time. It's a far more mixed experience for women. And I have that also in the back of my head. And so I want to hold space for a couple of different kinds of truth. One is that, yes, running the game can be fun. And there are lots of games that are designed to elicit particular kinds of pleasures of running the game or a game. But also that that's a disproportionate kind of labor that people take on in particular games that assume that only one person is buying the book, only one person is reading the book. The book may be very complex. And that while that may be a source of pleasure, it is an investment of time when many of us don't have that kind of leisure time, if ever we did. And that the contours of the ways that we talk about the hobby assume particular kinds of experiences, to the point when I brought this up on Blue Sky a few weeks ago. One of the many ways in which I got mansplained was the idea that, well, if you don't like it, and if it's not fun for you, then maybe you should do something else. And I don't think that's true either. I think there has to be a way where we can get to a place where the GM truly is another player. And there are lots of systems that are built on those lines. And yet I find so many of my friends falling back on this idea that they must be the ones in control. And maybe that's because I'm statistically more likely to have friends who are control freaks. I'm an academic after all. And I am too, right? Just what I'm realizing is in a very different way than many of my friends who thrive in the role of GM, who literally you will pry the GM screen from their hands. My D&D game tonight, for example, will never run with another DM other than Forever DM, my dear, dear friend. It just does not work. We've tried it. I've run it. He's happiest when he can run. Now, can he always run? No. He's the father of little kids who are mercifully getting bigger. He has a full-time job with caregiving responsibilities. These are very real things in our season of life. And while we'd like to share the load, his particular version of pleasure means that we either play with him running the game or we don't play at all. And I don't want my new group to operate in those kinds of ways. I don't want it to die if I'm not here, for example. I want that kind of sustainability, not only for me, but maybe for the, group that I'm bringing together in some way, shape, or form. My happiest moments as a scholar and a friend are the moments when I can see something that has continued to grow and thrive and develop, even when I wasn't in complete control or even involved anymore. People move, people grow, seasons change. So I'm starting with these GM-less games as the easiest on board, as I talked about in my previous video, of defamiliarizing the idea of what it means to play a TTRPG with people who have a lot of experience. I thought I was training newbies, but most of what I'm doing is actually showing a different part of the hobby to people who have firm ideas from D&D. And luckily, they're really excited about those possibilities. I'm so grateful and excited for that. And I think with time, we can do an orientation that allows us to move towards GM full games, as well as traditionally GM'd games, but maybe that we can take a different approach. And this is what I'm thinking about, and I don't have a lot of good answers, and I'm curious what you think. Is it possible to play games that have a GM in ways that don't make the GM the prime mover of everything? Can we move away from an auteur notion of how role-playing games work without having to throw out systems that seem really cool, that I really enjoy? And I don't know the answer to that, but that is the great experiment here. Not what if I just ran GM-less games forever and ever and ever. There's so much on my shelves that I want to play that does indeed call for a GM, even a GM that does prep. And here's the way in which I think I have hope about this, which is to say, the number of times I've watched a GM-less or GM full game get turned into a kind of control freaky deaky game by my friends who love being GMs. I'm thinking of a friend of mine who came to me having played Good Society and was really frustrated by the fact that there wasn't much for the GM to do. And I was like, how did you manage to make Good Society a game where you were only the GM and not a kind of facilitator player? And they did it somehow, I guess. Which is to say that there are plenty of folks who come at these kinds of story games or games that presume less GM power and authority and impose power and authority on them. So if that is the case, then surely it must be possible for me to literally flip the table in the same way that I flip the classroom. And you might be wondering, what on earth is flipping the classroom? Well, hello, friends. In my classroom experiences, we often have a notion of higher education as what we call the sage on the stage, a lecturer talking to you. That's what we hear and see in 1,000 pop culture representations, usually with someone who doesn't look anything like me at the front being the authority. That is a traditional notion of learning that assumes that you come into a learning space tabula rasa, totally blank, and are getting impressions. This is the Lockean idea from the 17th and 18th century, the idea that you will get impressed upon by knowledge, and that you are a little cup into which we pour knowledge. Friends, that's some bullshit. It's certainly not the way that my pedagogy works. When I come into a classroom, those classrooms are literally not possible to operate with a single focus because there are distributed tables where people are looking at one another because we're all learning from each other. We sit at a seminar table. I ask on the first day of class, literally, where do you know from? What are the things that you are bringing in that you know that maybe the rest of us don't know? And that isn't necessarily just, oh, we all have different majors, or we were different at better things in school. It's also, what kind of land did you grow up on? I often say I am the product of the swamp. I am where the Gulf of Mexico meets the Texas shore. It's the dirty side of the Mississippi. It is a place where bayou systems have made habitable land through artificial construction. It is a place that knows hurricanes much better than it knows earthquakes or tornadoes. And when ice and snow comes, forget it. We've got nothing. I have no background in terms of what my childhood taught me in those ways. Now, other parts of my life have taught me other kinds of things, but that's where I know from. Literally, the streets that I grew up on, that I drove to my grandmother's house on, taught me my first canon of English literature because they were all named after a textbook in 20th century higher ed. So I went past Wordsworth and Robin Hood on my way to Nottingham. That taught me too. And my students bring the red clay of Alabama, bring knowledge of the different places and peoples that they come from different ways of looking at the world. I often say I never knew a student who could say, I knew I always wanted to be a poultry scientist until I came here. And that's very true. And in the same way, I think that each of us has something to bring to the gaming table. Sometimes we talk about this as assistant DMs, or, the person who's the good note taker, or the person who brings the good snacks. Sure. But what if we didn't have to think in terms of hierarchical knowledge? What if we could come back to these single GM games and figure out how to flip authority so that we can all share it? It doesn't necessarily work for, say, most mystery games, except for, I don't know, maybe the Carve from Brindlewood system of emergent mystery stories. But I just have this sense that we can do better by sharing the load. I don't know. What do you think? Feel free to argue. Be nice and respectful. Life's too short to yell about things that are, after all, playful. But I'm going to my D&D game, which is run very traditionally, very strategically, and I appreciate that too. I just wonder what other colors there are in the rainbow, what other pleasures we can find, and what other things we can do together. Talk soon.